morning, everyone. My name is Nancy Khalek. I teach here in the Department of Religious Studies, and I'm happy to introduce our panel on Islam with our first speaker, Imam Daayiee Abdullah, the Imam and Religious Director of the Masjid An-Nur Al-Isslaah.
Salam, good morning. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about the issue of translation and practice. Quite often, when people contact me by emails or meeting in person or at events like this today, quite often they will ask the question, well, such and such scholar asked such and such or made such and such statement. And quite often, the people don't understand it, not because they don't respect academians, but that the language is above their heads. So the problem becomes that they don't understand it. So I find myself in a position of learning to translate the academic language into more common, simple, step-by-step processes. And this is where I find a lot of support and also find a lot of success. So with that, that's why I relate in terms of translation and practice. But before I get started, I just want to quickly go over some historical things. Basically, I've been in the queer movement for the last 45 years. In 1969, several months after Stonewall, I came out to my parents, Southern Baptists in Detroit, Michigan, and they were very supportive. And throughout 1970, I met a number of other Black and Latino queer people who also had support to their family. So I didn't wind up coming from a quote-unquote broken family relationship. And it was through that process that I was able to use my civil rights background as a child and teenager to move forward into the queer community and become an activist. But then later, it was actually in 1987 I actually came out at my MSA at Georgetown that I was gay. Of course, there was some rumblings there, but the process, they accepted me as anyone else since I was their senior, an older gentleman, so they were respectful of that. But then in 1994, I became more public, and then 1999 through meeting Faisal Alam and Al-Fataha development, much more into the Muslim community. And something happened in 2009 that was rather interesting. At the 30th anniversary of the first Gay and Lesbian March on Washington, which I participated in 1979, Elder Troy Perry with the MCC Church said, Daayiee, they had all the religious leaders, says, Daayiee, come up here and stand with me while I call out some of the names, because we're going to give them something to talk about. It was the first time a gay Muslim religious leader was on national television. So it was a really wonderful example that 30 years before, I was in the audience looking to the stage, and 30 years later, I'm on the stage looking out into the audience. So it shows that sometimes the circles that you're in do really go around. Basically, in terms of translating this practice, I consider myself, or have been called, the all-service Imam. Now, what does that mean? Well, because I believe in an inclusive concept of how the Quran is, and I utilize the UN Declaration of Human Rights as my filter, I see that the Quran can be interpreted in very broad, very wide, very deep, and very inclusive ways. So, for example, birth to death situations I participate in, doesn't matter who they are, what their background is, I believe people have the right, R-I-G-H-T, to have those particular religious rights, R-I-T-E-S, which many imams and many Muslims would not give to people who are gay, or LGBT, or someone who died from HIV, things of this nature. They would not provide those services because this person has sinned. Well, who are you to decide what is appropriate for them or not? And one of the things I question many of them when they bring the issue to me, I say, you're supposed to serve the whole community, and you don't do so. So may Allah be merciful on you. But in the same way, I do same-sex marriages. I've been doing so for the last 15 years. I will have to say that on Monday, this coming Monday, I'm doing a gay male couple from Texas. I'm doing their marriage in DC. They're flying in Sunday night. And of them, this is number 64. And of them, I've done 17 same-sex marriages, 11 well, actually 10 female to female, and this will be the 7th male to male couple. And then I've done 47 interfaith marriages of Muslim women to non-Muslim men. So you have to break down the barriers. If you're going to really live it, you have to live it on the ground. So breaking down those barriers, I have had many times talking to parents, family members, things of this nature, for them to understand why it's okay for them to marry a non-Muslim person. Okay, the same-sex marriage does work. And sometimes it gets into discussions of Quran, other times it's dealing with the issue of culture, because they understand Quran through their culture, not through a religious study. So sometimes you have to be sensitive to that. And I find that being sensitive, including in the marriages as well, that I provide them those cultural things that help combine the family together, so they're part of the whole family. The next thing I want to talk about is that the understanding our communities better is really important as LGBTQ people. Since we've had issues of dealing with being acceptance, think in terms of broadly understanding that accepting other people for their histories as well. It's very important. I find that times when I go places, I'm not certain if it's because I'm discriminating because I'm black, because I'm male, because I'm gay, because I'm Muslim, and it really doesn't matter because I'm going to do what I need to do anyway. But I am sensitive to other people so that they understand, or I understand them when I'm talking with them, having the dialogue, having the conversation, being a good listener, and really listening, and if not understanding, asking those questions. So that's why I say that in terms that I've been successful as an all-service imam, because I take it seriously. Another thing I think is very important too is that we have to acknowledge those who've come before us. I met a gentleman in 1982. His name was Albert Hurt. He was 92 years old, a black male from Minneapolis, grew up in Minneapolis, and he was an openly gay man, had been all his life. I met his boyfriend who was 78. And one thing that he taught me in my interactions with him was the aspect of continuing to have your dignity. Now, that means that I can go back to a person who was born in 1890, 125 years now. So we have to look back to those people. It's not to take away anything that we do today, but to recognize that we stand on the shoulders of others who've come before us. And to do so, to recognize it shows that you know your history and the continuity of it. It's very important. Audre Lorde says something very important, which is that when you decide to make a change, it's going to be uncomfortable. But through that uncomfortableness, you will find yourself and you will find peace. So you have to challenge those things. So I do have something that I generally ask people when you take those things who come before you. Ibn Khartoum makes a comment, and I think I remember it properly. Unthinkingly following customs and traditions of dead people doesn't mean that the dead are alive. It means that the living are dead. So we have to remember that some of these things that we've been told are coming from ancient understandings of things who could never understand what we're dealing with today. And so we have to understand it through the process of rereading it in our own understanding, in our own time. And when we do that, it makes a significant difference. Now, I did a TED Talk a few weeks ago, and my conversation was the need for spiritual revival and reformation within Islam. And I have a particular statement I ask people, been doing it the last couple of years. And that question is, in about 100 years from now, 150 years from now, we're going to have people living on other planets doing whatever they're doing, and I'm certain there'll be Muslims there too. So I have a question for you. Which way is Kaaba for prayer? Many people ask me, well, what is the answer? I say, I don't know, but I'm certain that 150 years from now, those Muslims will have an answer that will be perfect for their time, their place, and what they need to do. So for these Muslims and these Muslim clerics to tell us that, well, the way it was done in the Hadith and they reported it, it's supposed to be such and such. Bull. Bull. Okay? Because the process is that they could not know that. And if we accept that, then we put our own heads on the slaughter block. If we challenge them and know that we may not have all the answers, but that we're living for today, under today's circumstances, for our needs for today, we're going to live much better lives. And since the history of the Quranic Reformation had been about every 150 to 200 years, there's been a Reformation, we're now in the cycle for the Reformation on gender, women, and sexual orientation. So definitely this is something that we have to look at. Let's see, is there anything else I need to cover here? Okay. The last thing I'd like to talk about, which I'll take a minute or two, is that I am in the process on a major project. It's called Mecca. Mecca is it's the Middle Eastern Center for Creative Academics, and what I've done is talk to a number of Islamic scholars from around the world, and we're coming together as progressives to develop an inclusive Islamic theology. And so part of this process, and it's called Mecca Institute, it's mecca-institute.org. You can go there now. Our website is not officially open, but you can see some stuff there now. And our goal is to change the paradigm, to have a global chorus of Muslim voices from around the world saying that we're going to look at these things, environmental issues, religion, social justice issues, things of this nature, which is important, and we're moving out of the East-West kerfuffle. We think it's time now that we really think about how we're going to make our world better for the long term. So I want to invite you to go there, take a look, and in September when we open, take a class or two. We need to make this school work so we can change how Islamic schools teach, how Islamic schools get their information out, and that there are alternative views. The problem is that everything else is always the same. You know, it's like chewing tobacco. It's always the same thing. But in reality, there's always been room for alternative perspectives, even throughout Islamic history. So we have to be ready to understand and ready to accept that alternative understandings of Quran is available to us. And so I encourage you to take that step, baby steps if need be, but take that step, stand up, and become the people of today seeking a better future. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Sondy, Assistant Professor of Islamic Studies at the University of Miami.
Good morning. I'm going to speak a little bit about my book, which just has come out in paperback, The Crisis of Islamic Masculinities, with Bloomsbury Academic in London. From what was the central thesis of my dissertation to the central thesis of my book, I argue that the multiplicity of Islamic masculinities has been developed, sustained, and constructed by a variety of Muslim men and women throughout history to the current day. The different foils that have been used may shift, but the primary and central goal and aim of these various Muslims has been focused on the ultimate relationship and submission to God. I remember speaking with a friend in Glasgow about what he understood to be masculinity in Islam. It's all about the Prophet Muhammad, isn't it? He's the perfect model, he said. But what exactly did that mean? The Prophet Muhammad's life is extremely colorful and is inextricably bound to the revelation of the Quran. It is these different shades within the life of the Prophet Muhammad's life that has allowed for a variety of images to be painted of the last prophet of Islam. It is for this reason that I focus on prophets and prophecy within the Quran to explore the question, which prophet's life leads to an ideal Islamic masculinity? Was it their lived example, their gender, their marriages, their lack of marriages that lead us to a concrete conclusion of Islamic masculinity? My research led to no answer to this end, yet found that what was common to all prophets was their central relationship and submission to God. The varieties and shades of their lives supported my thesis that the Quran, that divine and inimitable text from God celebrated a variety of different gendered lives and actually does not promote an ideal of masculinity or femininity. By including other prophets within my chapter, other than Adam, Joseph, Jesus, and Muhammad, would underline my basic point. In critically analyzing the Quranic world's messy and even dysfunctional Islamic masculinities, we see how they complement the lived realities, which in a way make the text seem more human, more difficult to domesticate. The book opens with the figure of Maulana Maududi, a political theologian, to highlight his construction of Islamic masculinity that is particular to the Indian and Pakistani context, but is one that reigns supreme amongst political Islamists throughout the world. It is meant to take as its subject the most rigid, the most contemporarily relevant and foundational spin on Islamic masculinities. The way in which Maududi strengthened his ideas of gender roles and sexuality through his interpretation of the text and law continues to carry weight for many Muslim men and is often not challenged because it upholds the status quo of men at the center. A 20th century political Islamist, Maududi hardened the conception of Islamic masculinity by aggressively interpreting scripture, collapsing it with historical precedent, and presenting his own opinions and idea as theology, as tantamount to God's opinions and ideals. I wrote this book not as a corrective, and it is for this reason that I was clear at the outset that I am not a theologian, but have traced theologies through the variety of case studies that I have dealt with in the book. I wanted to bring in opposing voices and images that relate back to the most rigid forms of masculinities and femininities, the forms that a political Islamist like Maududi tried so hard to uphold as the ideal. This leads us to the feminism chapter, which was the most difficult to write. I decided several years ago that I would not talk about Muslim women because I believed that they should speak for themselves. But as I dug deeper into the masculinity question, I realized how intertwined it was with femininity and women. It was difficult to avoid, and I have tried extremely hard to include the many voices of Muslim feminist writers. I spent a considerable amount of time thinking closely about using the term Muslim masculinities or Islamic masculinities, and I opted for the latter because I feel that often the term Muslim is used to identify someone who is striving for the ultimate form of Islamic. But as I interrogated the question, it became clearer to me that this divide has been part of the issue in presenting monolithic understandings of masculinity and femininity. It was as if the Islamic is unattainable or something sought, much like the ideal masculine or feminine form. To include all the varieties and shades of masculinity within the rubric of Islamic, I felt it opened up a panoply of Islamic masculinities and in turn led to the same for Islamic femininities. I am then calling for a deeper discussion on how the terms Islamic and Muslim are constructions, are connected to the human. The Islamic of the political Islamist Maududi and the Islamic posed by some Muslim feminists who oppose the rigidity of what means to be purely Islamic, masculine and feminine, are both Muslim and are both Islamic. Even the most divine text, the Quran, fails to prescribe not only what it means to be or exist, to function or act, but leaves open the vast possibilities of what this notion or idea of submission truly means. In fact, I am hoping that this book leads us to questions beyond the restricted gender binaries of male, female, masculine, feminine that is often restricted to clear-cut ideas surrounding gender and sexuality. Let us not forget that it is the same Quran that led Islamic legal scholars in the medieval period to allow the legal capacity to a third sex that did not easily fit within the male or the female box. From Maududi's rigid notions of masculinity that use women, God, and even the West as a foil for this, to the call of Muslim feminists who challenge Maududi-esque constructions by stating that constructs of man, God, and women, and the West need not depend on othering. In fact, reorienting Muslim life around submission or surrender, the very definition of the word Islam at once appreciates the all-encompassing human condition that equalizes gender and activates the intrinsic value of multiplicity in interpretation. Tracing major feminist critiques of the Quran opens up a discussion of the Islamic masculinity or masculinities, because that's precisely what feminists have to address. Family is the nexus of patriarchy, text, and society. Because feminists don't want to abolish family, text becomes the preferred site for resistance. It is for this reason that I have begun to call the Quran a perfectly ambiguous and superbly dysfunctional text. The Quran is at the very root of all shapes and forms. The ethical and moral consequences are what plagues those who wish to uphold a particular form of Islamic, be it from reducing or killing the liberty of another human being to destroying one's own self for the liberty of another human being. It is these outworkings that pushed me to include the word crisis in the title. Yet I wanted the reader to delve into all the shades and see exactly how Muslim men and women have moved from rigidity to fluidity, and the mechanisms that they utilize to present their own formed and reformed Islam, not as a recent phenomenon, but as something that has been happening from the very beginning, as far back as Adam and Eve. After discussions on Maududi and Muslim feminist response, I wanted to now turn to the fundamentals of the Islamic faith. The one text that 1 billion or so Muslims believe is inimitable, perfect, and clear. What does the Quran say about Islamic masculinity and femininity? After an extensive survey of the Quranic world of human beings, I found no single form of Islamic masculinity, and in turn, I argue that the work of sociologists and anthropologists is clearly upheld by this particular scripture. Raven Connell, the pioneer of masculinity studies, tells us that there are no two men alike and that we must start speaking of masculinities. I found that there are no two men alike within the Quran. The Quran is full of men, women, prophets, angels, supernatural beings that all have only commandment to fulfill, and that is submission only to God. The Quran appreciates and celebrates that this singular commandment from being to being cannot be replicated. It is for this reason that Islamic cultures vary, Islamic acts by men and women vary. I spent considerable time studying Arabic in France, Syria, and Jordan, yet was always puzzled by this Arabo-centric view of Islam that seems to suffocate forms of Islam that are established beyond the Middle East. In my book, I aim to destabilize this by locating my argument in India and Pakistan. Placing special focus on India and Pakistan further destabilizes any monolithic image we, both inside and outside Islam, may have of the Muslim man as Arab or Middle Eastern. If one is to seek varieties of Islams or Islamic masculinities, then one must seek an alternative image of Islam beyond the Arab world, which often have dominated discussions on Islam. In critical and even Quranic terms, then, South Asia is fruitful grounds for counterexamples that allow us to read against the grain of mainstream Islamic tradition to expose its inner workings and make sense of diversity which need not be self-contradictory. I had to select certain examples and omit others because I wanted to write a book that was accessible and not a tome that no one would read. Even with certain other examples being omitted, I feel that the same conclusions about multiplicity and masculinities are mirrored within other contexts. Returning back to India and Pakistan, we take another example, from a political Islamist one to an Islamic feminist one to a Mughal example of what would essentially be perceived as hedonistic Islamic masculinity in the life and work of Mirza Asadullah Khan Ghalib, the renowned 18th and 19th century Urdu and Persian poet who raises a tension between his spiritual existence and the Islamic norms prevalent in his day. With his fondness for alcohol and courtesans alongside his perhaps laissez-faire perspective on the taking of young male lovers, Ghalib began to see himself as un-Islamic. He certainly was not the picture of Muslim masculinity that Maududi would later draw. He was a paragon of a poet who was characterized by a certain hedonism, a search for love that expressed itself in pleasure-seeking. He did fulfill marital and childbearing obligations too, though he actually maps for us a viably Islamic alternative masculinity because he satisfies social responsibilities in addition to his outside pursuits. His struggle to identify within the Islam that he actually held so dear foreshadows the predicament that global Muslim communities or the Ummah find itself in today. So we do well to linger in Ghalib's Mughal world for a bit. Although he never characterized himself as a spiritualist, many of Ghalib's thoughts, practices, and experiences align him with Sufism, the mystical branch of Islam. Defined by a similar and single-minded quest for ultimate love, I then move to another picture of masculinity and femininity that is not always seen on our TV screens. Sufism allows otherwise obligatory social relationships to bend around this one preoccupation or simply fall away. Shah Hussain, a 16th century Sufi saint, challenged Islamic conformism through his unruly spiritual dance and his romantic relationship with a Hindu boy. At the heart of Sufi expression was this quest to release itself from the rigidity, the legal extrapolations that had emerged from the Quran. Sufis continually challenged rigid notions of Islam that they argue lose sight of the ambiguous, the grey, the shades of love, the unruly, the questioning rhetoric to God that looks upward. The Qalandari Malangs, those antinomian mystics who are again situated in India and Pakistan, provide an extreme and therefore useful site for analysis too. They are essentially wholly abject, often propertyless and wayward. Malangi men sometimes begin to take on the appearance of women through clothing, accessories, and effect. Something of a trend in recent scholarship attempts to proffer Sufism as a resolution for all issues of restricted gender and sexuality. But the Malang movement is still largely a male one, and they have trouble shaking all the trappings of patriarchy. It is perhaps too much to expect of any community could do that much, and Sufis like the Malangs do show that more fluid gender can come from an unswerving dedication to communing with the beloved, with the one, with God. However, this case study also tests the limits of the hope that simple commitment to submission will uproot systems of social dominance and constrained ideals of gender. It is these varieties of Islamic colors that I aim to present in this book. I hope there continues to be further interrogation on the relationship between masculinity and law. I deliberately avoided a chapter on Islamic law because as I was exploring the many lived realities and especially reading the silences of masculinity and femininity, I realized that this imagined notion of Islamic law looms largely on the heads of men and women. I think there is something quite scary about law. It sharpens the edges and psychologically pushes one to consider some form of order and monolithic position. But when one turns to the sources of that law, the Quran and the prophetic traditions, one sees how much softer the edges are. I think these softer and more ambiguous edges were mind-boggling for the medieval jurists who wanted to create social order in society. They remain steadfast in their resolve of sharpening the edges. Through the select examples of my book, we can begin to see that those Muslims and non-Muslims who seek to be the reformers of Islam are in fact missing the point. Muslim men and women from the very beginning have been understanding, forming, and reforming their own claims on what is Islamic. In the current state of affairs, where we seek quick fixes to our understanding of Islam and Muslim, which inevitably leads to state politics and grossly generalized understandings of Muslim men and women, we fail to appreciate diversity. The challenge for Muslims in the past and in the present is how to embody the letter of the text to their lived reality, their human experience. At times, I've been left rather perplexed after reading academic studies on Islamic thinking. And so what? This book, if I may state so boldly, has taken on board that so what question at every step of the way in hope to open up a debate among academics and non-academics who realize how important and significant it is to understand the complexities of Islamic masculinities and for a moment dabble in the complexity and ambiguity of defining Islamic masculinities and femininities. Thank you very much.
Said, Barbara did a lot to bring me here, so I'm really grateful. So I'm talking today about contemporary scholarship on Islam and homosexuality. My remarks are based on an annotated bibliography that I put together, which is currently under review for publication. It contains 150 entries, and it's concerned with English language research that has been published in the past 2 decades only. I intend to walk you rather informally through some of the landmarks of this bibliography, so please come and join me. In the beginning of the modern period, writing and observations on same-sex sexual practices in Muslim lands were predominantly conducted by Western travelers to the Orient. But prior to these, in the pre-modern contexts, scholars from the Arab world, under patronage of various Islamic caliphates, wrote about human sexual behavior and desires. Some categories of desire constructed by these scholars, including subject positions themselves, so including people who weren't the scholars but whom the scholars cited, are comparable to the contemporary understanding of homosexuality as an erotic preference for members of the same sex. However, much debate surrounds the specific issue of whether, when we look into the sexual praxis of pre-modern Muslim subjects or pre-modern subjects in Muslim lands, there's some contention over whether there was such a thing as homosexuality in the way that we moderns and postmoderns understand the term. So therefore, the construction of a bibliography of this kind is going to be, maybe, and is often rendered problematic. And it's something, that problematization is something of which we would do well to be mindful. However, in view of a vast body of pre-modern literature from various Islamic geographies and temporalities, what is of no or little controversy is that Muslim scholars of the medieval world fashioned conceptions and categories for sexual behavior and erotic preferences. So if these discourses were not describing homosexuality, at the very least they were conversing about that which homosexuality describes. So the contemporary scholarship on Islam and homosexuality is Frankensteinian in nature, and the bibliography reflects this. You have your sociological and anthropological studies, limited to specific locales and temporalities in most cases. You also have your hyper-theoretic cognizance that speaks in broad, generalized abstracts instead of embodied specifics. You have your medievalists who are limited to analysis of remaining text and cannot study live cultures for obvious reasons. And you also have your religious reformists and theologians and literary critics. You may occasionally find people dabbling in international relations and development theory as well. What you don't have, with a rare exception, is the original Muslim scholar archetype, or the scholar who operated under the Islamic caliphates, not necessarily Muslim. The polymath, the scholar who becomes proficient across disciplines and methodologies to see what is really going on across a range of fields and systems of thought. That is why a bibliography of this nature can best be described as cartography. It surveys a broad landscape that defies the institutional call and confinement to specific specializations. The Frankensteinian effect is a result of the inefficient way in which modern scholastic institutions of higher learning organize creative intellectual pursuits. When Joseph Mas'ud writes in Islam in Liberalism that you have writers who are not specialists talking about Islam and homosexuality, he means this as a failing somehow, as a shortcoming. He thinks he is advancing a critique in which the authority of the investigator is being unraveled and that their credibility is being undermined. I don't expect any differently from anyone to whom the institution has been so very accommodating and who has become seminal simply by virtue of their attachment to a private university in North America. Interestingly, however, the medieval Muslim scholars on whose practices the modern scholastic institutions of today are based were all polymaths. I think of Tifashi, for example, who wrote about sexual behaviors in one book and classified gemstones in another. or Al-Jahid, who wrote about the animal kingdom and on sexual practices, but also wrote about the art of horse riding and warfare. I think about Al-Kindi, who was a terrific philosopher, often referred to as our first philosopher, but who has also wrote about sanitation in addition to writing about human sexuality. These thinkers were not confined to a compartmentalized approach to knowledge formation. There was an organicity to their intellectual pursuits driven by necessities of investigation, necessities that are now regulated by funding language, position descriptions, field specializations, acquired degrees, and perhaps most importantly in this context, the canonization of Saint Michel Foucault. It's true. The fact is that a scholar working on the juncture of Islam and homosexuality faces the danger when institutionalized, and when I mentioned Foucault and I mentioned the word institutionalized, I'm punning here, of being a pink triangle that the current structures are trying to squeeze into a circle. There is no safe or comfortable or nurturing place for this kind of work in the institution. But it is precisely this kind of work that the public, including other scholars and academic publishers, find so compelling and for which they have a very high demand. To really do a service to the question of gender and sexual variance in Islam and the Muslim worlds, one needs disciplinary agility that, despite all the rhetoric that has emerged regarding multi and interdisciplinarity in the academy, is not only discouraged in this context, but is actively aborted. The study of Islam and homosexuality produces far too many anxieties to be supported as a secular and multidisciplinary field of inquiry. It may be as simple as a combination of homophobia permeating traditional Islamic studies departments on the one hand, and Islamophobia in otherwise liberal, transnational, and even intersectional departments of women's sexuality and gender studies. Islamophobia is not necessarily simply hatred of Islam. On the left, it manifests as a fear of offending traditionalist Muslims. Among Muslims themselves, as one friend remarked to me last night, Islamophobia is the fear of examining one's own religion, the fear of giving oneself the authority to read and understand scripture and history. One of the other interesting features of the map of contemporary scholarship on this subject is titled Metacognition of Islam and Homosexuality. So much writing has discussed our thinking about Islam and homosexuality. Such writings ask, what does it mean to think about both Islam and homosexuality? Who produces such knowledge, and for what purposes? Conspiracy theories in this literature abounds. There is this empire headed by an invisible Darth Vader decimating local sexual practices and violently or insidiously replacing them with Western concepts and practices of sexuality. On the other hand, the less apocalyptic alternative view, which imbues local subjects with some level of agency, sees that transcultural and transhistorical equivalencies are possible, in which one could speak of homosexualities beyond Western patents on constructions of such. Gleaning over the section of the map, you will find interesting public debates in education and pedagogy journals. For example, the debate that was set off in the UK in 1999 when same-sex education became mandatory in schools. And some Islamic schools were resisting to teach that homosexuality is a natural variance from the norm. This begged the question, if homosexuality as a sexual orientation is incommensurate with a Muslim paradigm for reality and social organization, which, let's be honest, for a majority of Muslims, it actually is. And if Western liberal democratic societies are allegedly required to provide a space for all, irrespective of differences, can Muslim communities reasonably be forced to accept homosexuality or else be seen as homophobic? And in this section, the inverse of the above question also emerges from the perspective of gay rights. Are gay rights necessarily Islamophobic if they cannot accommodate a religious minority, this is in the West, which, with some exceptions, cannot accommodate them? Aliardo Zaglini provides a thoughtful alternative to Jaspir Puar and Joseph Massad's post-colonial model, in which gay rights discourse is seen as such, and in which Islamic homophobia is not open to interrogation. In the last 10 years, we have seen a growing interest in the study of living Muslim cultures, both in Muslim majority contexts and in diaspora. The bibliography charts this growth, and what's interesting is not only that we can now see which geographic spaces have been given attention, but also the geographic spaces that have been omitted from such a purview. For example, while Egypt and Lebanon may get some representation, the same cannot be said of North Africa, which is rife with an old, substantial history of gender and sexual variance related to Sufi Islam. I find it astounding that there is no scholarship whatsoever in the English language on the Sufi Zawaya in Tunis and Morocco, which have had same-sex marriage rituals for over 200 years, for example. Has anyone ever heard about the Sufi Zawaya marriage ceremonies? It's astounding. Viewed in its totality, this section may assist researchers undertaking or planning a regional study in identifying gaps in scholarship. One unpublished master's thesis reports on the queer community in Canada, which is rather vibrant, while several articles are dedicated to Canada's southern neighbor. And why is it that more studies in Europe focus on Holland than any other country? Is there a relationship between the level of national discourse on Islam, which is nearly always predatory and phobic, and the number of researchers seeking to study it and homosexuality, because the latter is a convenient marker of Western liberalism somehow, like we see in pinkwashing, for example? Could homosexuality be an index then for how topical the juncture of Islam and Western liberalism is in a particular nation state? I believe, yes, this is so, and that the only way to dismantle oppressive constructs of Islam, be they constructed at the hands of self-professed owners of the faith, or those who seek the annihilation or assimilation of Muslims, is through coupling through these difficult tensions, time and time again, to willfully incite discourse. Only through subsistent pressure might we be able to unblock the fascial adhesions that have so compartmentalized the way we have been allowed to see the world. That Islam needs to be set aside in one corner and homosexuality over in the other corner as an extension of Western liberalism, and completely ignore that they are both features of an all too common human condition: religion and sexuality. As a passionate scholar of gender and sexuality in the Arab world, I remain steadfast in my pursuit of knowledge, not in reproducing the thesis of some great theoretician who has long died and in whose shadow I aspire to keep warm. I think of the ways in which some theoretical paradigms become so dominant that they become orthodoxies, even when originally they were intended to de-seat orthodoxies. And I think of the ways in which the academic institution stifles rather than nurtures human intelligence. Unfortunately, we live in an age where our intellectual pursuits are compromised by the very institutional structures that facilitate them, by the dominance of certain paradigms over others. In my previous books, as in this bibliography, my intention and hope is to provide tools with which we can continue to resist the automization of our intellects. Because therein lies the heart and mind of true scholarship. We have to re-examine the faith of Islam because it has been hijacked by militants on either side. And the faith itself needs recovery. I say this not as a fact, but as a prayer for my bleeding Arab country, for my Syria, for my Iraq, for my Yemen, and for my Palestine. Thank you.
Our final speaker is Scott Kugle, Associate Professor of South Asian and Islamic Studies at Emory University.
I'm gonna sit here. Is the microphone on? Can everybody hear me? In the back? Is that better? Is that okay? In the back? I'm not sure the microphone's on.
It's on.
It is, okay, all right. So this is so it is a real privilege and an honor to be sitting with all these people, in front of all these people, and thank you to everyone who made this happen. It's a very special occasion for me because of some old Swarthmore College connections which have gotten reconnected through my being invited here. I started out my teaching career teaching at that small and wonderful college down near Philadelphia. And I was a Islamic studies professor at that small place when 9/11 happened. And suddenly being an Islamic studies professor seemed like a very different profession. And that led to the beginning of my research and writing about Islamic theology and sexuality and gender identity. Okay, maybe I can try this microphone instead. Is that better? No?
Okay, hang on. Perhaps we can ask those who are hiding in the back to move forward rather than having the speaker yell into the mic.
Okay, thank you. I'll do my best. My research and writing on Islamic theology and gender identity, sexual orientation began, I think, at that moment. Several years later, I was invited to participate in a book project. That was the Progressive Muslims book. And that book was going to bring together an international group of scholars, mostly based in North America, but from many other places. And the editor contacted me. This is Omid Safi. Many of you may know him and follow his work. He said, this book is not going to be complete. It's on gender, justice, and pluralism. There needs to be something there on homosexuality. You need to write this. And I backed away from that challenge for a very long time because I hadn't gotten tenure yet. As Samar brought up, there are challenges within the academy to writing on these topics, and one has to be very strategic about how to approach it. But I also felt I wasn't qualified, really. And many of the speakers here have been trying to pass this basic message that is, you are qualified to do your own research in theology. If you're a believer, you're not only qualified, but you're called by God's voice in the Quran to do that for yourself in whatever situation you're in. And so shying away from this challenge for many months led me to reflect a little bit on myself as a religious person, as a believing Muslim, as somebody who was going to be forced to put on a theologian's hat, which is exactly what I was forced to do. So now I'm sitting up here in front of you kind of as a theologian. I change hats often. A historian, also a theologian. That was not my goal, but I was sort of forced into it by circumstance. So beginning to write about this, there's one chapter in that book, Progressive Muslims, which was really about the Quran, not so much about Islamic law, really not so much about hadith, not about ethics, not so much about Sufism. It really focused on the Quran. And I still think until today that's where the primary focus needs to be. Even as we do research about the Islamic legal tradition, and especially the hadith corpus, the hadith reports. That is a very central topic that is only beginning to be touched with a kind of faith-based analysis that's so required. But reactions to that chapter, both negative and overwhelmingly positive, frankly, spurred me to think about doing a more serious and long-term project. And that project began in 2004. I had to quit my job at Swarthmore College to do that, and went to the Netherlands. Partly, I think there are two things going on in the Netherlands, just to comment about what Samar was saying. One is that, yes, there's a heightened discourse of Islamophobia and anti-immigration in that country, linked to the issue of gay rights in some very nefarious ways. But at the same time, there are actually universities and non-university funding organizations that fund research and take a pretty bold position on that. So one of these funding agencies, it no longer exists anymore. It was called the Institute for the Study of Islam in the Modern World, ISIM. And they funded a 2-year research project, which I went to do. The idea of this research project was to do a liberation theology study. None of us have said liberation theology, but I think that's what all of us here are doing. In many ways, many of you in this room are doing it in your own situations as well. But liberation theology, which came out of the Catholic Latin American churches and was adopted in other ways by Protestant churches, especially black Protestant churches in Atlanta, near the area where I stay, across the South. Also in South Africa, you have Protestant liberation theology confronting the issue of race inequality primarily. That was the paradigm that I wanted to use. And we have Farid Isaac, who's a great teacher and writer based in South Africa, who's written about this and given us tools. I thought, let me take up the challenge and do this. And what liberation theology means is that we have to engage with living communities and interview individuals about their struggles, their positions, their understanding of who they are as faith-based actors in society, whether they are activists with a capital A, or whether they're just active in their own lives trying to make a more secure, a more fulfilling existence. So liberation theology the approach is to interview real people, to assess real situations, and then pair that with God talk, talking about God, which is a direct translation of theology. Many contemporary theologians try to get away from the word theology because it sounds so scary or medieval, and to talk about God talk. How do we talk about God? And how do we hear God's talking to us through the Quran, through our own experience? So the idea was to do a dialogue between real experiences of people in struggle, in sometimes very difficult situations, and a textual-based, legal-based, scriptural-based inquiry into theology. Luckily, there are many LGBTQ Muslim support groups. Many of the people here are involved in them. Many of you have been involved in your own locations with these groups. And I decided to interview people who volunteer, not necessarily leaders, but people who are volunteering and active in these organizations to be the communities that I speak with and interview and try to understand, and then use that as a platform to reflect on theology. Now, in 2 years, I was able to do this in South Africa and the United States and the northern neighbor, Canada, and the UK and the Netherlands. All countries with Muslim minorities and all countries with secular democratic constitutions. And that was an important framework for the study. However, doing a study and publishing it is a struggle, is a different struggle. So we had to deal with publishers, and I found that a publisher was very interested in the theological part because it was kind of sexy. Many people wanted to read about sort of queering Islamic theology. And a publisher took that part of the study up as a book, which came out as Homosexuality in Islam. What didn't get taken up for many, many years later were the life stories of the people I interviewed. A more journalistic or ethnographic account of people living in families, living in communities, struggling with gender identity, sexual orientation, often both of them entangled, and thinking about their own position as believers, sometimes rejecting religion, sometimes finding a spiritual orientation toward religion that was not provided by their family or their upbringing, sometimes really engaging with the texts. Many of the people I talked with actually did Quranic interpretation on their own, whether they knew Arabic or whether they were working through translations into other languages. And through this process, I also met many, many people who were really doing theology in formal and informal ways. People like Imam Daayiee, a longtime conversation partner, has been writing on the internet for a very, very long time. Other people like Imam Mohsen Hendricks in South Africa has begun to publish works. There's also Omar Nahas in the Netherlands. I think he's now in Belgium. He's a Syrian gentleman, trained in scholarship but not finding work as a scholar. But he's actually written an Arabic language piece in 1995, which was published in the Netherlands. It doesn't circulate very widely, but it's there, called Al-Junusiyya. It's a very interesting early take on trying to queer Islamic theology. So it took a long time for the interviews with some of these people, and an interview with Imam Daayiee is in the book. An interview with Omar Nahas is in that book. I tried to get a range of different ethnic national groups represented, also a range of gender identities, male, female, trans people. That was harder to achieve than to aspire to, but it's an ongoing challenge for all of us who write and publish. Happily to say, many years later, that book of interviews has been published. It's called Living Out Islam, Voices of Gay, Lesbian, and Transgender Muslim Activists, published by New York University Press. And I think those two books stand together in dialogue with each other. At least that's how they were written for me. Now, that's a practical demonstration, I think, of what all of us on this panel have been talking about. That is the ethical, very urgent ethical need to rethink belief and systems of belief that we've inherited from family, from tradition. Sometimes it's imposed on us by national legal systems, but often not. And we're challenged to think and imagine, to imagine ourselves differently and to imagine our religious tradition differently. The great philosopher Muhammad Arkoun, who's passed away recently, an Algerian professor teaching philosophy in France, has written a book called Thinking the Unthought in Islamic Thought, where he really challenges Muslims across the board to think clearly about what has been unthought in the past. And I think that's what we're doing together here in all of our individual careers that brought you to this room, and for many of you in your formal scholarly or political work. You're thinking about the unthought. The question is whether the religious tradition, especially the Quran, but other parts of it, are resources for that rethinking or obstacles to that rethinking. I have some commitments on that question, which I get sometimes put down for. A lot of people think that the Islamic tradition is the root of the problem, not part of the solution. Again, I have my own existential faith commitments about that, which lead me to go back again and again to the Quran especially, but also to the legal texts, which are quite painful to read and deal with and demand a lot of technical training. It's not easy, especially for people who self-identify as queer in whatever variety, to get madrasa training or university training to actually grapple with Islamic law. But it needs to be done, and it needs to be done systematically. Finally, the hadith reports as another textual basis. Those of you who do Islamic law and Quran interpretation realize that all of the coercive or punitive criminalizations of same-sex behavior are not based on the Quran directly. They're based on hadith reports. And so hadith reports are really the last frontier for critical rethinking of theology. Again, they throw up many, many challenges to researchers. The work that I've done is very limited to Sunni texts. I'm coming out of a Sunni background, and my familiarity is with Sunni texts and methodologies. There's a whole field of Shi'i Islamic jurisprudence that relies on other texts and some slightly different methodologies. People from Iran or from Lebanon who have a Shi'i background or who have expertise in this need to be encouraged and nourished to take the steps to do that work. Because Sunni Islam is not the only Islam. We all know that, and yet the scholarship doesn't reflect that. Finally, and this is where I want to wrap up, is the organizers of the conference really urged us to reflect on sexuality, but also to think about imagination. What does it mean to have an imaginary? And really, religious belief is about imagination. It's about seeing this world and seeing something beyond it. Something that's unseen, as the Quran says. To believe in the unseen is an act of the imagination. Of course, to imagine anything, you need a framework. You need images, you need language. We work with the stuff of real life, even when we're dreaming of something which is not quite real. And in imagination, we are experiencing things that aren't quite real yet. But in imagining it, we make it real. Or we set the conditions for making it real in later generations. So this idea of imagination or khayal in languages that Muslims use, not just Arabic, but Urdu, Turkish, others, khayal is an important term in Islamic theology. It's a crucial term. It's the idea of the alam al-khayal, the world of imagination. There's a whole world there between the divine and the angelic and the material, sensory world where we're trapped. There is this interface, a world of imagination, where we receive ideas from somewhere else and clothe it in the forms that we know, right? And this is why, I'm just going to wrap up. This is why, if we think about prophets confronting angels and bringing divine messages, which is sort of the bedrock of Islamic theology, those angels always appear in human form. Why is that? Angels don't need to be human, do they? They're not. Why do they appear to Bibi Maryam? Why do they appear to the Prophet Muhammad? Why do they wrestle with people in a very physical form? That all exists in the realm of the imagination, you could say. The perception of things that aren't physically there in forms that we physically can recognize. And I think that the kind of reformist theological thinking that we're trying to nurture among ourselves by being in conferences like this, by being in the communities, sometimes activist, sometimes devotional, where you belong in your daily life. Or even in rejecting religion altogether. That's an important stance, to spur people to reform. That imagination is a crucial tool. Don't shy away from imagination. You're all empowered to imagine God, your own life, in a different way than is enforced by families or traditions around you. Nobody can take away that power of imagination. It is integral to your fitrah, as the Quran says. Your very human nature is the ability to imagine things are as they are not immediately right now. So that is the last sort of reflection on doing this Islamic theology. I get such fuel and vitamins and nurturing from being in environments like this and being invited to speak with people like you. So thank you for your invitation for me here.